Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Confusion, chaos, malfeasance, lawsuits, recounts. Welcome to the dark aftermath of election 2020. Welcome back into Liberty Nation Radio, a production of LibertyNation.com and heard from coast to coast on the Radio America network. Is President Trump in denial about the apparent outcome of the 2020 election? Or is he right to declare victory amidst his loud accusations of fraud and the casting and counting of ballots in multiple battleground states where the results show razor-thin margins? The election feels no more settled now than the day before the election, so where in God's name do we go from here? We'll talk out the presidential race as well as surprising results in the House and Senate with the best and brightest from LibertyNation.com, Editor-in-Chief Leesa K. Political Columnist Joe Schaeffer, plus Legal Affairs Editor Scott Cosenza on some of the most explosive ballot initiatives approved by the voters. Well, at least we didn't get widespread violence of the kind everyone expected. That's about the best you can say about an election for the ages, but not in the way either side had hoped. The everyday men and women behind President Trump wanted 4 more years, and they haven't gotten that, though they still have hope. Joe Biden and the left wanted a thorough, ringing repudiation of President Trump and his supporters, a full cleansing of the stain of Trump, and they did not get that. Instead, we got something that, if you think about it, was pretty predictable. A close election with a pandemic-driven, record-shattering number of mail-in and early votes, leading to charges of voter fraud, voter suppression, malfeasance, and the casting and counting of ballots, particularly the millions upon millions of unsolicited ballots flooding the zone in Democrat-run states, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan. This was always how this was going to end, barring a blowout by either candidate. Now, if you don't think Trump has a legitimate argument about fraud, listen to what the Federalist wrote in an article entitled, "Yes, Democrats are trying to steal the election in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania." Here's what they wrote. President Trump led former Vice President Joe Biden by comfortable margins, far beyond what had been predicted in the polls. None of the networks called these states because enough mail-in ballots remained uncounted that it could swing either way. But Trump's position looked good. Then something strange happened in the dead of night. In both Michigan and Wisconsin, vote dumps early Wednesday morning showed 100% of the votes going for Biden and 0%, that's zero, not even one vote, for Trump. In Michigan, Biden somehow got 138,339 votes, and Trump got none, 0, in an overnight vote dump. Turns out the vote dump was a result of an alleged typo, an extra 0 that had been tacked onto Biden's vote total in Shiawassee County, Michigan. It seems the error was discovered only because the Federalist writer Sean Davis and other Twitter users noted how insane and suspicious the vote totals looked and demanded an investigation that uncovered what was either a typo, as the vote counters claimed, or an incredibly clumsy attempt to boost Biden's vote count. Now, when Sean Davis tweeted out the publicly available information about this incredible outcome in that county, he was censored by Twitter, which, by the way, has censored Trump repeatedly on election night and beyond. Now, the article continues. In Antrim County, Michigan, where Trump beat Hillary Clinton by 30 points in 2016, initial vote totals there showed Biden ahead of Trump by 29 points, a result that can't possibly be accurate. Then, another mysterious all-Biden vote dump happened in Wisconsin. Biden miraculously overcame a more than 4-point Trump lead in the middle of the night, thanks to vote dumps in which he got, you guessed it, 100% of the votes, and Trump got 0. Now, these facts should be deeply disturbing to everybody because it calls into serious doubt the very integrity of the most important election in the world. One thing you can be sure of is that the Trump legal team knows all the stuff I just described and much more, and that this is far from over. The fight will continue to the bitter end, especially when the fighter in the ring is the same Donald Trump who single-handedly took on a political and media establishment built over decades and beat them. And it looks like it will be Trump against the establishment and the Trump-deranged forces of the left one more time, with the stakes higher than ever. Quick break, and then we'll be back to discuss how the polls got it so wrong again, plus how the pandemic cast its shadow over this race and the lessons we've already learned from election 2020.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Well, the polls got it wrong again in the 2020 election. The final Real Clear Politics average of mainstream polls had Joe Biden winning the popular vote by more than 7 points, and right now he's ahead by just over 2 points. Battleground state polls suddenly showed tightening near Election Day after months of showing big deficits for President Trump baked in. One poll soon to live in infamy from NBC News and the Wall Street Journal the week before the election had Joe Biden up 17 points in battleground Wisconsin, where his actual lead is less than 1 point. Were these polls just plain wrong? Or were they used as a vehicle for the left to depress the vote for Trump? Can the polling profession as we know it even survive? Joining us to answer these questions and try to paint an impressionistic tableau of a 2020 election that will be a source of continuing anxiety and outrage from the movement ignited by Donald Trump more than 5 years ago is LibertyNation.com editor-in-chief and most notably my better half, Leesa K. Donner. Hello, Leesa.
Hi, Tim.
Well, so what is it? Were these polls just plain wrong, or were they used as a device by the left to depress the vote for Trump?
Well, their ineptness and incompetence is evident, but I think it was just that they're plain old lazy. The one poll that I paid a lot of attention to was the Trafalgar Group, led by Robert Cahaley. And what they did was they dug down into each state. And any pollster worth its salt will tell you that a national poll is really of no use. So when Trafalgar dug down into each state, they pretty much called everything right, except for Arizona.
Now, you've said it was deeply suspicious. We watched the election together. You found it deeply suspicious how the counting suddenly shut down after about 11 p.m. on election night, with Trump ahead in virtually every battleground state. But at the same time, we knew all along that the mail-in and early vote would be heavily Democratic and would be counted last. How do you reconcile those two realities?
Well, having covered lots of elections, I think it's safe to say that COVID forced this one to be different. And what happened was that overzealous legislators at the state level stuck their hand in the pot with loads of new election laws. And that became the recipe for the disaster. I feel that, they decided that the additional ballots wouldn't be counted that night, or they decided to shut down the counting in certain areas, or just it seemed like a random thing that they were just shutting it down. But then it seemed almost in concert with other states. It was just odd.
Okay, so continuing with the polls and playing devil's advocate, factoring in the real element of the shy Trump voter, the Trump voter just didn't want to talk to anybody about his support of Trump. Was it, or is it even possible to conduct accurate polls in this era where Trump has completely changed the political dynamics of yesteryear?
Look, it's entirely possible. As I mentioned, the Trafalgar Group did it. I think Rasmussen looks closely at things. I think in this day and age, you have to, and I don't necessarily think it's the Trump shy voter. I think it's that people are becoming more and more difficult to poll as our country becomes balkanized, as you would say. You know, there's two Americas going on here. And so when you call people racist and misogynist and xenophobic, they're not going to be as open about their vote. Not to mention that some of these polls, you know, they want to take up 20 or 30 minutes of your time. What Trafalgar does is they keep it short, they keep it simple. 8 or 9 questions, boom, you're done.
How much did the pandemic factor into this election, do you think? Would Trump have won if it didn't happen? He may still win, but would he clearly have won? Would he have won decisively if it had not been for the pandemic?
Yeah, I think it hovers somewhere between a lot and a ton. I think he would have had a much easier time because people generally vote on economics, and you know, Trump had all the economics going his way: unemployment, GDP, trade. It was all there for the taking.
Now, the result of this election is yet to be fully determined, but it's going to show that Joe Biden has won the election. And, you know, absent voter fraud, which is, of course, a big concern here. And we have many people who think that Trump actually has won the election. But suppose he hasn't, and suppose most of what you're seeing in terms of the vote totals are accurate. Might America be saying that 4 years of Trump and all the upheaval that went with it was enough, regardless of whether he fulfilled so many of the precedent-shattering promises that he made in 2016, that they just had enough?
You know, again, I think we're looking at two Americas, one that seeks to promote freedom and liberty of the individual, and one that looks at everything through a collective lens. And so you had people voting on personality versus policy. You had an enormous media confrontation with the president. And I think that could have moved the needle as well.
I'm starting to ask myself the question of whether the voters might be saying that they needed Trump for a radical course correction, but not for a permanent one. What I mean is almost like bringing in a high-powered consultant who shakes things up for a while, puts in place systemic reforms, and then leaves.
Well, you know, it seems to me that the media was able to define Trump, and he gave them plenty of fodder to do that with. You know, he's a guy that I think why some voters like him is that he's what you see is what you get. And he figured that he got to where he is by just being himself. But I do think he underestimated the power of the entrenched Washington swamp.
Right. It was one man against a powerful media and political establishment built over decades. That's a hard fight to win. He did it once, but not a second time unless he can overturn what we're seeing now. Last question for you, Leesa. What did we learn about America in this election? Not what we already knew, but what did we learn that we might not have known before?
Well, I think what we are learning right now is that we're having a serious problem with our election process. And I'm writing an article for Liberty Nation right now, which will probably be posted on the site tomorrow, about transparency and voter fraud. I mean, we're not a third world country where party apparatchiks should be able to, behind closed doors, do whatever they want. You know, we should have transparency. And this is why I think the Trump campaign is seeking some relief from the court system. The problem with the court system is that the wheels turn very slowly in the courts. and it's not meant to issue, swift and timely decisions. Our election system, our national election system, and I know we have 50 state elections, but we should have some rules. And far be it from me to ask for more rules, but just some basic rubrics saying, election day, the voting ends. And if you can't count it by election day, it doesn't count. Or if it's in 3 days after election day, it doesn't count. I mean, we just can't have 50 different sets of rules here. It just is turning into a mess.
Well, Leesa, thank you so much for your wisdom here. And also, congratulations for such a wildly successful election week for LibertyNation.com with record viewership. It almost shut down our server at multiple times. Congratulations to you and the entire team at LibertyNation.com.
Thanks, Tim. It's been an honor to propagate what we hope and what we believe to be the truth and the facts.
Leesa K. Donner, editor-in-chief of LibertyNation.com. Quick break, and then we're back with a closer look at the kind of fraud being alleged by President Trump and his legal team, and discuss the legitimacy of the outcome being reported.
Ready, set, go!
Stay ahead of the curve with LibertyNation.com, because we put the power of the press in your hands. With one click, Liberty Nation delivers tomorrow's news.
And remember, liberty.
Today.
All the time and everywhere.
Liberty Nation connected the dots between a Chinese research biolab and a wet market where COVID-19 was supposedly discovered 2 months before the MSM. 1776! We were first to alert you of a serious attack on gun rights in Virginia. LN honed in on the Biden-Burisma scandal months before it hit the papers. We brought you exclusive interviews from the border.
We're looking at people just rising up.
Liberty Nation was on the ground in London.
Trump rally in front of the American Embassy.
Bringing you on-the-scene reports about Brexit. LN reported that COVID-19 was more virulent but less deadly weeks before others. LibertyNation.com delivers tomorrow's news today with LNTV's Liberty Nation Radio, the Uprising and Rabbit Hole podcasts, and dozens of insightful original articles and a new Roku channel. Stay ahead of the curve with LibertyNation.com and get tomorrow's news today. LibertyNation.com.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
A great deal of uncertainty still surrounds the 2020 election. No matter what the vote count says, President Trump is just getting started with legal challenges and recounts. Pennsylvania, Georgia, Nevada, Arizona, Michigan, Wisconsin might all be open to challenge in one form or another. But other than validation of the reality that we're a deeply divided nation, we've learned a bunch of things already from this election, and here to help us understand the takeaways from this election is our old friend, LibertyNation.com political columnist Joe Schaeffer, who maintains that Trump has won the election, and he'll explain why. Welcome back, Joe.
Hello, Tim. Good to be here.
Well, always good to have you. Now, Joe, I rarely share personal messages with our audience, but I'm making an exception today because when we discussed you joining us on the show, you wrote back, Trump won. That is where my analysis will come from. This is massive voter fraud, and it's poorly done massive voter fraud. Go ahead and explain to us why.
And I think it's important to know it's not really surprising. It's just a continuation of what we've seen thrown against this man since 2015 when he went down that escalator. How many coups have been attempted against him by the establishment since he's been in the White House? This is just the latest. This is, to me, it's so similar to Russia impeachment, getting Lieutenant Colonel Vindman out there and all that stuff. Let's look at what happened. I mean, in-person voting, Trump's romping. He's winning the states that he needs to win. The Rust Belt states, he held on to all the Republican states he needed to have. Everything is going as expected. There's really no surprises. And then we get this massive ballot dump at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, wiping out huge Trump leads in these states that he has to win. And for them to just attribute it to mail-in voting, and that explains everything, that is the big deceit that I refuse to accept. I don't care what kind of voting you're doing. It is beyond normal unless you're in a Soviet country behind the Iron Curtain in the 1960s for one candidate to get 90, 100% of the votes. They are trying to tell us, because of the coronavirus, that Democratic voters did the responsible thing, stayed at home and cast in their mail-in ballots. And that justifies Joe Biden having 75, 80% of these ballot dumps coming in these key battleground states that just so happen to be close. It's so crazy.
On the other hand, Joe, we knew all along, and we had the count ahead of the election of the 100 million votes cast before Election Day by mail-in or advance voting, that like 60-some, close to 68% of them were Democratic. So you say predictable. Wasn't it also predictable in a fair sense that we'd be getting big Democratic surges beyond when the polls closed, because that's when they'd start counting the early votes?
So let's look at this. Before, when they were pushing in their mail-in balloting, it was, you can go back, I've read several of the articles, and I would recommend our listeners and viewers do that. Go back and read what they were saying about mail-in balloting. And I'm talking in April. They were saying it's not going to make a significant difference. It's not going to be that substantial. This is just Trump talking points, because Trump was saying this is going to open the doors to mail-in fraud. So what did they have to do to really make this mail-in voting secure? They had to push their coronavirus hoax. And I'm using the word hoax. The coronavirus itself wasn't a hoax. The lockdowns, the social curbs, the over-the-top response was a hoax. And now we know why that hoax happened. So they could have their mail-in balloting. The mail-in balloting itself isn't the fraud. It makes the Democratic fraud easier. And that is what we're seeing. I would agree that Democrats may have some advantage. But when you have dumps where Joe Biden's getting 20,000 votes and Trump is getting like none in Wisconsin, I mean, that doesn't happen. And it happened at 4 o'clock in the morning, 5:30 in the morning. They knew the lead Trump had. Well, isn't that a lot easier to wipe out the lead when you know how many votes exactly you need to get to do it? This is so suspicious. This is so wrong. And it stinks to high heaven. It really does.
Joe, given that many of these states, most of them, perhaps all of them, will segregate the votes that came in by mail and that came in early, but particularly by mail, we'll get percentages, won't we, on what percent went to Biden and what percent went to Trump. And if that is above 55, 60%, maybe 65 tops, will that by itself be a basis for a challenge, do you think? Just publicizing that?
That is going to be a huge red flag, and we're going to see those red flags flying everywhere. You tell me, how does a 300,000 vote advantage in Michigan get wiped away in a couple of hours? If you're just whatever you're doing with these batches of votes, how were you able to arrange it so it would happen like that?
Right.
I mean, this is mathematically impossible. It can't happen. I wrote a late article. I went to bed around 4 a.m. Trump was up 120,000 votes in Wisconsin with 90% of the vote in. That's why I saw 88, 89%. I woke up 3 hours later. He's down 20,000 votes. It's 140,000 vote change, and 95% of the vote is in. So 5-6% more of it came in. You literally every vote, pretty much, plus some others, over 100%, would have had to have gone to Joe Biden for that to happen. It doesn't make sense at any level. I think this is going to be easily exposed if our court systems work, if our legal system works, if we're truly not a South American banana republic. And, based on what I've seen in 2020, we may be. But if we're not, I think Trump is not going to have a difficulty exposing a lot of this fraud. I don't care what they say about mail-in balloting being harder to prove. This was not really that well done, is how I see it.
Well, we got a lot ahead on that count, but it does look like Republicans will continue to control the Senate, barely, and Democrats will still control the House, but they lost 5 seats when they were expected to pick up as many as 20. What were the voters saying with their congressional preferences, do you think?
And this will not be given the credit it's due. I think this is President Trump helping the Republicans in ways that the Republican establishment will never acknowledge. 2018, Trump isn't on the ballot. They lose the House and struggle with the Senate. 2020, Trump's on the ballot. I think you can make a very strong argument that is why they gained in the House. And especially, I'm going to say President Trump is the reason they kept the Senate. Look at some of the awful candidates that ran as Republican senators this year. McSally in Arizona, I've written this. She's one of the worst candidates I've ever seen in my life. She just is not a good campaigner. Everybody says it. She was a disaster. I would actually say she probably cost Trump votes in Arizona, people who didn't love Trump, but would have gone out for a good Republican Senate candidate. But we're talking about Congress here, so let's focus on that. So we lose that. The Republicans lose that seat because they insisted on trying to shove McSally down the throats of Arizonans. Then you go to Georgia, and I know Kelly Loeffler ended up getting through, but she was a weak candidate too. And I would say if Donald Trump isn't on the ticket, excellent chance Tom Tillis loses, who's a GOP establishment Chamber of Commerce guy. He loses, Republicans lose the Senate. Donald Trump very well could be and I think he is the reason Republicans still hold the Senate today.
No matter the final certified outcome of this presidential election, the populist movement ignited by Trump looks like it's not going away anytime soon. What would you see as the future of that movement if Donald Trump is no longer president? Will it survive? Will it thrive? Can it thrive with the continuing hatred of Trump's supporters by establishment and progressive forces?
Well, I think what this big, massive voting fraud reveals, again, is the establishment side is not popular. We said this all along. Joe Biden, historically awful candidate. I don't care how many votes they're saying he's going to get. I stand by that. He ran an atrocious campaign. He had no excitability factor, nothing. It just so happens our country is so divided, as you said. You could literally run a head of cabbage with a blue sticker on it, and you, as a Democrat, and you will win the Northeast corridor in the West Coast. So we know this. How do Democrats win presidential elections? They got to get a couple more states in that Rust Belt, that working class Rust Belt. So for Republicans to be, establishment Republicans say, oh, Donald Trump is gone, our problems are solved. You are not going to win elections in that Rust Belt. Trump proved the formula for Republicans winning presidential elections. And that formula was proven again in this election. You take care of your Republican states, the heartland. Look how he performed in Florida and Texas that some people were worried about. He dominated there. And then you win those working class, blue collar, Rust Belt states. He won them on election night. I maintain he won them. He won Pennsylvania. He won Michigan. He very likely won Wisconsin without this massive voter fraud. So if Republicans want to win elections, you cannot move away from this America First blue collar labor movement that Donald Trump has crafted for this party. It's not going away whether Republicans abandon it or not. It is a force no matter what happens with these results for years to come.
What an elegant recitation of the significance of the Trump movement, whether he's president or not. I think it's pretty clear he's going to continue to be a dominating force in American politics, even if he's on the outside rather than the inside. Joe,
might
thanks.
Make him stronger.
He might be. And we'll discuss that in a future show because a Donald Trump throwing bombs from the outside after he's done it from the inside could be an entirely different force of nature. But thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Joe Schaeffer, LibertyNation.com. We'll break away for a moment, then come back with a look at all the other things on the ballot, including a dramatic decision by the voters of Oregon about drugs, and in California about Uber drivers and affirmative action.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Well, Donald Trump and Joe Biden were hardly the only ones on the ballot in this election. There were 470 races in Congress, 435 in the House, and 35 in the Senate, with the GOP likely to maintain control of the Senate and Democrats the House. But there were all manner of ballot initiatives in various states, including one in Oregon that produced a somewhat earth-shaking result. Back to join us afresh is our regular contributor, constitutional lawyer, LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor, and a man who these days we particularly rely on to be our guardian of individual liberty, Scott Cosenza. Hello, Scott.
Hello, Tim.
All right, let's go right to Oregon, where the big news came on decriminalizing possession of everything from mushrooms on up, what they call hard drugs.
That's right, Tim. Oregon has decriminalized possession of every drug. You will not go to prison in Oregon for simply possessing contraband drugs. That includes cocaine, heroin, you name it. You can either pay a fine or seek some drug counseling, but no longer will people have to go to prison. Now, they won't be able to go buy or, drugs legally in Oregon. This is not having to do with any kind of sales or manufacturing or anything like that. This is merely about punishing people who possess those drugs for their own use. They will not be prosecuted criminally in Oregon going forward. In 4 states, we have 4 new recreational or non-prescription marijuana options: Montana, South Dakota, Arizona, and New Jersey. Now, New Jersey is a blue state, and Arizona may be. We're still waiting to see for sure.
If it isn't one already, it's becoming one.
But for Montana and South Dakota to both join the community of states that say we're not going to put people, through the criminal justice system for marijuana, that's a big change, I think. And again, more and more states and more people in more states saying they're not in favor of criminalizing drug use for people in that state.
Okay, Scott, so that's it for the drug ballot initiatives, but there was another very significant one in California, Proposition 22. After the California legislature converted Uber drivers from independent contractors to employees, this proposition was designed to reverse that. So it was a pretty significant consequence. Tell us why.
This, I think, this may be the most money ever spent on a ballot initiative ever. I think it was over 200 million on the winning side. I don't know how many millions were spent on the other side, but what it does is it allows Uber to contract with people to be Uber drivers without employing them. And the effort and managerial and data keeping and all the other kind of bureaucratic tasks that involve hiring somebody, not to mention the liability incurred, would make Uber's business model either kaput or have to be radically altered. And if that were the case, Tim, for California, that may then be the case for Uber nationwide. So it is a consequential decision for everybody who takes an Uber or drives an Uber or relies on an Uber, to be sure. And also, we keep saying Uber because it's a convenient shortcut, but Lyft, DoorDash, all these gig economy things, and many of which have sprouted up and grown, geometrically in the face of the coronavirus and other people relying on, folks to go to the store for them or what it might be. So this says that those people are not employees. Now, unfortunately, for somebody who's liberty-minded, it does increase the restrictions on how you can engage somebody like this. So there are minimum, for lack of a better term, wages that must be paid outside of the employment designation. So unfortunately, those gig economy workers and the companies that wish to engage them now have more bureaucratic tape to cut through and deal with, but it's not the death knell that the previous law, which was AB 5, delivered to that economy.
Well, the thing is, Uber was always constructed as was Lyft and the others, on the idea that everybody that works for them would be an independent contractor. The entire business model was based on that until the California legislature stepped in, supposedly in defense of the little guy, all of whom took on the responsibility of driving for Uber and others, knowing what the parameters were.
Let me please just stop you there and just say that it's not fair for us to pretend that this is somehow the other side of that campaign was mounted by just people who wanted to be employees. It's about a union attack on Uber because Uber's independent contractor don't pay union dues. And the people who wish to collect those dues would do anything legally, certainly at least, to collect them. And this was an effort for them to be able to collect a fee for every Uber ride through the unionization of the riders if they were of the drivers if they were employees. That's what this is about. That's where the money came from to motivate that campaign.
All right, so we'll come back to California if we've got time, but let's go to Illinois first, where there was a ballot initiative about a graduated income tax.
More money was spent on this than any other campaign, except for the Uber campaign we just talked about, Tim, this year. It was a big campaign in Illinois. And basically, this was an eat the rich measure, as I see it. And it would allow people of different incomes to be treated differently with respect to the taxing authorities. Right now, in Illinois, if you have to pay income tax, if you make $100,000, you pay the same rate as if you make $1 million, if you make $10 million. I just think that it was great that the people rejected this kind of, division of people that we see oftentimes that wants to take away liberty from people that are particularly financially successful. And another, I think, surprising measure out of California was Proposition 16. Affirmative action was banned in California by proposition some years ago. Well, the people who benefit from affirmative action were motivated to try to reintroduce race-based discrimination in California. Well, the voters of California rejected that by 56%, by the way, at the last time I took a look at the number. So I think it was a positive news for liberty up and down the board on the referenda and initiatives this cycle.
Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Tim.
Scott Cosenza, legal affairs editor at LibertyNation.com. This program, Liberty Nation Radio, and LibertyNation.com's own podcast, The Uprising, hosted by Scott, plus The Rabbit Hole, Politics and Prose, where past is prologue, with Mark Angelides. All available on demand at LibertyNation.com and from fine podcast providers everywhere. So that is it for this week. We'll be back at you next week when the presidential election race will probably still not be decided. Till then, this is Tim Donner saying stand up for liberty, and we'll see you next time on Liberty Nation Radio.